Good evening and welcome to a Tysky Sour budget special. And we're going to be going through all the big policy announcements, what it means about the current direction of the Conservative Party, what it means about your finances. I mean, I'm probably not going to be able to give you all of the details on that, but we'll try our best. I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Have you been glued to Sky News today? I suppose, however you watch big announcements in Parliament.
I don't do Sky News, Michael. Do you do Sky News? I mean, I shouldn't. I actually like Sky News, but no, I often watch BBC just because I think that's what most people are watching. I watched it on Politics Live, and then I tuned out after 2 p.m.
I was actually a little bit torn between the budget and Nicola Sturgeon's committee hearing, which we are going to be talking about later as well. Very, very dramatic what was going on there. To talk about the budget in a moment, I'll be joined by Jeevan Sundar, who's an economist and former Treasury official. I want to take you through some of the key moments of the day before we discuss what happened. First of all, though, you know the score. Do share the show link, tweet on the hashtag TyskySour, comment under the Twitch stream, and put your super chats under the YouTube video. Now, as Rishi Sunak likes to occupy the limelight, there are many ways the public could absorb today's budget announcements. Alongside the traditional presentation of the budget in the House of Commons, there was a blitz of social media clips with Sunak explaining the key policies to camera. Then this afternoon, Sunak broke with convention to host a televised press conference. Here were the key themes.
Today's budget is a three-part plan to protect the jobs and livelihoods of the British people. The first part is this: we're going to keep economic support in place until well past the point that we exit lockdown. The furlough scheme, support for the self-employed, business grants, business rates holidays, tax cuts, and the temporary universal credit uplift have all been extended and generously. But that unprecedented level of support, combined with the damage coronavirus has done, places huge strain on our public finances. Simply put, we have to get borrowing and debt back under control. So the second part of today's budget begins fixing that. Now, some people think we should ignore this problem, or worse, there are some who think there is no problem at all. But I think that's wrong. If we don't act once the economy has recovered to control our borrowing, we won't be able to fund the stronger public services people want to see. And when the next crisis comes along, we won't be able to respond with the boldness we have this time. So I want to be honest with you now, today, about how we'll begin fixing the public finances. This budget is helping people develop new skills, start an apprenticeship, and get better paid jobs. This budget is helping small business owners get the training, skills, and technology they need to compete with bigger firms and become the high-growth companies of the future. And this budget is bringing prosperity to the whole United Kingdom, with new free ports around the country and the largest pro-investment tax cut in modern British history, making the time to invest right now and the place to invest right here.
The key announcements. Rishi Sunak saying we offered you lots of support. We will continue to do so for the period for which the pandemic lasts. And then saying this is going to build up a load of debt and we're going to have to pay it back with some taxes, and then looking to the future. We're going to go through these in, I suppose, somewhat granular detail. So let's go through some of the key announcements. We'll start on that coronavirus support, which he was talking about. So in terms of that, probably the biggest pledge was this one on furlough.
The furlough scheme will be extended until the end of September. For employees, there will be no change to the terms. They will continue to receive 80% of their salary for hours not worked until the scheme ends. As businesses reopen, we will ask them to contribute alongside the taxpayer to the cost of paying their employees. Nothing will change until July, when we will ask for a small contribution of just 10% and 20% in August and September.
So you can see there he's saying that the furlough scheme will now go on until September. Some people worrying, does that mean that actually restrictions are going to continue beyond July? Is there something we don't know? I think probably more likely he's just worried about there being a huge cliff edge and everyone becoming unemployed in the summer. So this is a way of sort of tapering out, helping people out of the pandemic recession or crisis that we're in. Let's look at some of the more coronavirus support measures that have been announced. So as well as the furlough, the self-employed support scheme will be extended until September, and the £20 universal credit uplift will be extended again to September, although I should say that actually means there'll be a cut to universal credit in 6 months' time. And to sort of, I suppose, compensate people for that cut, they're going to give a £500 one-off payment to people who claim working tax credit. So the real story there, the extension of furloughs, but benefit cuts to come. Of course, still no money for people to self-isolate, but that was a given. Let's go on to tax. So it was a proposed increase to corporation tax that caused the biggest political stir in the run-up to the budget. Here's what Sunak announced.
So the second step I am taking today is that in 2023, the rate of corporation tax paid on company profits will increase to 25%. Even after this change, the United Kingdom will still have the lowest corporation tax rate in the G7, lower than the United States, Canada, Italy, Japan, Germany, and France. We're also introducing some crucial protections. First, this new higher rate won't take effect until April 2023, well after the point when the OBR expect the economy to have recovered. And even then, because corporation tax is only charged on company profits, any struggling business will, by definition, be unaffected.
So corporation tax will be going up from 19% to 25%, but not for a couple of years. And we can go to the further announcements on corporation tax and taxation in general, So we can also see corporation tax rate will be kept at 19% for those companies with profits of less than 50,000. Corporation tax will be tapered for profits of between 50,000 and 250,000. And the big tax announcement was probably that personal income tax allowance will be frozen. So that does mean that people will be paying more tax even if the tax rate hasn't changed. Finally, let's look at the bigger picture. What is the Tories' long-term vision from this announcement, including how they plan to level up?
Our future economy demands a different economic geography. If we are serious about wanting to level up, that starts with the institutions of economic power. Few institutions are more powerful than the one I am enormously privileged to lead, the Treasury. Along with the other critical economic departments, including BEIS, DIT and MHCLG, we will establish a new economic campus in Darlington.
So alongside that announcement to move parts of the Treasury to Darlington, only 750 workers. It's probably more symbolic than anything else. In terms of the long-term plan, they also announced that firms will be deduct investment costs from tax bills, reducing taxable profits by 130%. That's supposed to be to encourage businesses to invest, to increase productivity. There will be a new UK infrastructure bank to be set up in Leeds that will have £12 billion in capital and aims to fund £40 billion of public and private projects. There'll be £15 billion in green bonds, including for retail investors, to help finance the transition to net zero by 2050, a £1 billion town fund to promote regeneration in 45 English towns, and a green mandate for the Bank of England. Now, joining myself and Aaron to discuss the budget and everything that Rishi Sunak announced is Jeevan Sanda, who is an economist at King's College London, a former Treasury official, and most importantly, another podcaster. Jeevan is co-host of Politics Jam, a podcast that looks at the week's news through the lens of political science. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jeevan.
Hey, how are you doing? It's wonderful to be here, Mike.
Absolutely. Can I get you to start by, I suppose, telling us what you see as the big picture here? I've sort of gone through some of the details of the budget. I want to know, as an economist looking at this, what is Sunak thinking? What's the big idea?
Well, for me, the first thing I look at in any budget is, does it make child hunger go up or down? And this chancellor and this budget made child hunger go up. And that's why I think it was disgraceful. You know, to not keep the universal credit uplift in place does mean more children going hungry. It means that low paid key workers like nurses are going to see £1,000 pay cut in 6 months' time. They risk their lives in this pandemic and they're going to see a fall in pay. They're going to be forced into food banks as they were beforehand. And so, yeah, I think that was wrong. I think that was morally abhorrent as well. It's a disgrace, and that has to be fixed in the future. I suppose going on, I think some of the other things we saw today, investment and public spending. So it looks like a good story on investment. We'll see exactly what the Chancellor wants to do in the future with that. But on public spending, and this has been a little bit, I think, under the radar, it looks to me like public spending in 2025 will be lower per person than it was in 2010. Now, we should remember, since 2010, needs have risen, the population has gotten older. As well as that, we've also seen the after effects of the coronavirus pandemic. So we're going to see some real problems with public spending. And finally, housing. Now, for me, we don't talk enough about housing in this country. We don't talk enough about its impact. This mortgage support guarantee is going to be like the Help to Buy scheme before it. It will lead to higher house prices. And what does that do? Well, it means you live in an economy where what matters is who your parents are and not how hard you work. When house prices go up, who can afford to buy a house? It's not young people who work hard. It's young people who have rich parents. And the higher house price, the richer your parents have to be. And in the future, those young people will own those houses. And so for me, that is another really big story out of this budget. We're creating this rentier economy where it doesn't matter what you do. What matters is who your parents are and did they have the good sense to buy a house in London 10 years ago.
Aaron, I want to get your take on the budget. What for you is the big picture here?
I would agree with a lot of what was just said there. I would say there were effectively two budgets here. One was what we just heard in terms of pay restraint for the public sector, not addressing the housing crisis, actually trying to inflate another housing bubble, which, you know, that might not sound like it's plausible, but if you look at what's happened to London house prices in the last year, they may rocket up again over the next 12 to 18 months. I think that's the plan effectively. But then there was another budget, which is what I think is causing a lot of political interest from unusual quarters. Now, I don't agree with the idea that, they are now implementing Labour policies, that, you know, Rishi Sunak is listening to John McDonnell. Somewhat, yes, but I think principally no. What I do think is interesting is that alongside that restraint, you're also seeing the outlines of how a progressive left government could govern. So, for instance, the National Infrastructure Bank, yes, it's not sufficiently capitalized, but that's an institution which, with serious money behind it, could do really impressive stuff. Exactly the kind of thing John McDonnell talked about. You saw it, you know, before that with the idea of a national renovation agency with DARPA. Again, that's a DARPA-like agency. That's a United States sort of research and development agency. Again, that's something a left government in the future could capitalize differently and perhaps set it particular socially useful objectives. Could be very, very impressive. The Green Bond, the same. The Towns Fund, the same. So I thought there are some interesting long-term breaks with Tory orthodoxy, Osbornomics, which shouldn't be sniffed at because actually they're very popular and they're also, you know, offering the outline of good policy. And then, of course, there's the corporation tax increase to 25%. Now, I'd be interested in our sort of general discussion and perhaps some of the comments about whether or not that will happen. I think it will happen. But what I think it means is two things. Firstly, it's trying to incentivize as much kind of front loading of this stuff over the next couple of years, trying to stoke up a bit of euphoria, I think. And then, look, if there's high rates of growth, high rates of profit going into 2023, there's no big deal. If there's low rates of growth, if we're not seeing kind of a lot of the lost kind of GDP over the last 12 months not made back, then they'll just defer it, right? But I do think the Tories are cognizant of the need now in terms of maintaining their present electoral coalition. They can't go back to Osborne and pre-2019 and say, you know what, we want 18, 17% corporation tax. I think they know they can't increase tax on cigarettes, alcohol, petroleum, generally speaking. And so, you know, given the broader context of, yes, a high deficit, that's not the end of the world, but also wanting to spend money on things that matter to this new electorate of theirs, they're going to have to find the tax from somewhere. And so I think it's a really, really important budget for that. And also, I'd finish with this. I think people in 2019, the December 2019 election, looked at the Tory result and said, wow, that can't be beaten. It's very possible that the Tories actually expand their electoral coalition at the next election. It's very possible, partly because, you know, they may be very fortunate with the business cycle, partly because Labour is just a complete you know, clusterfuck. But I think it's very possible they can basically achieve what they did in late 2019, that kind of Brexit coalition, plus maybe 5%. I don't think that'll happen, because then you're looking at sort of high 40s. That's not really happened, I think, since maybe the 1951 election, or maybe one of the Thatcher elections. But I think it's plausible, because they had absolutely no credibility on, for instance, green issues, you know, climate change and so on. I think their view is they can't win on the NHS. They can't win on, you know, amongst public sector workers. They'll try and nibble into Labour's vote through green issues and perhaps making some kind of offer to young people, although that wasn't there today. So politically, a hugely important budget, but I think it's being somewhat overstated in terms of the fundamental shifts on policy. But it does prepare the ground for a very different kind of political economy in the 2020s to what we saw in the 2010s.
I mean, I think there wasn't really an offer for young people, but they're hoping to create more young homeowners. So if they just win over a very small proportion of young people by giving them these cheaper mortgages, the people who can afford to buy a house, then you might have a few more people who are less tempted to vote for the Labour Party. I want to focus now on the question of how progressive this budget was. Was it borrowing from John McDonnell instead of George Osborne? And I want to start with someone who's suggesting maybe to some degree it was. This is George Eaton from the New Statesman. He tweeted today, policies Rishi Sunak has borrowed from John McDonnell, increasing corporation tax, a national infrastructure bank, a Treasury HQ in the north, and rewriting investment rules to end London bias. That last one is a reference to rules which used to say we invest money where we get the most money back, which would inherently favour those places which were already wealthy, which was why money poured into the south instead of the rest of the country. So there are some interesting points there. It is also true, and this seems fairly significant to me, that taxes will be at their highest level as a proportion of GDP since 1969. This is from the Office for Budget Responsibility. So this is a Tory government who are now overseeing the highest taxes as a proportion of GDP, as was last seen when Roy Jenkins was the Chancellor. Obviously, this has a lot to do with the fact that the economy has shrunk thanks to coronavirus, not just because of tax increases, but the two obviously have sort of intersected in a way. So it's still a much higher rate of tax than we have seen in the past. However, and this is sort of the case against why it's not a budget that could have been written up by John McDonnell, is because there was no mention of the NHS, really, none at all of social care. And in most public services, austerity will be continuing. And this is a graphic put up by the Institute for Fiscal Studies after the budget. They're showing there that whilst in certain protected areas of spending, the NHS and schools spending will go up by 5%. They've also got overseas aid there. That's taking into account the cut from 0.7% to 0.5% already. So it's going up 5% just because growth is going up 10%, I suppose, or 5%, sorry. And what they're showing is that the unprotected sectors of public spending, that's going to go down 1%. So after a whole decade of cuts, for example, to local government budgets, that's still going to shrink further. And John McDonnell is also not convinced. He doesn't think they're necessarily taking his policies. So he tweeted, Sunak steals my rhetoric, but no substance. Working people hit by income tax rise as thresholds frozen. Council tax rise, pay freeze for public sector workers, cliff edge cut in universal credit in months, nothing for disabled on legacy benefits, and over 2 million still excluded. Jeevan, I want to get your take sort of on, you worked in the Treasury when George Osborne was Chancellor. And I think sort of, as you've pointed out, there are still huge gaps in this budget. And for most working people, it's not only not offering enough, but it's going to be offering a pay cut in many respects. There's a public sector pay freeze, for example. But to what extent do you think in other areas, the Treasury, who is supporting Sunak in writing up this budget, has learnt from some of the mistakes of the previous decade? Do you see that this is coming from a fundamentally different Treasury to the one that you worked in under George Osborne?
I think sadly not fundamentally different. I think there's been a shift as the zeitgeist has shifted, right? When the IMF and the OECD are saying to you, look, austerity is not the right call at the moment, then you start to see the Treasury view start to shift slightly. But ministers also have a huge direction over that shift, right? If a minister says, well, I want to cut spending because that's what I believe, a Treasury's view or a civil servant's job is to say, okay, how am I going to make that happen? So even if the civil servants' views might have changed a bit, and I think they have, and I think we've also seen that even on the Conservative benches as well, the overall Treasury view very much will be directed by the man at the helm, and the man at the helm is Rishi Sunak. Now, it is unfortunate the way he views government borrowing and government debt. We borrow at 0%. We'll have a debt to GDP ratio after this of about 115%. Japan, 250%. And they also borrow at 0% interest rates. Rishi Sunak doesn't seem to really understand how government borrowing works. What determines the interest rate on government bonds is economic growth. When you're growing strongly, your borrowing costs are a bit higher because there's lots of competing demands for investment. And so it's sad, but I think that fundamentally the question is, what does the Chancellor believe? And the Chancellor seems also to have latched onto this figure of 100% of debt to GDP. And I have no idea why that is. Like, it's a round number, but it's like 5 to 10 times off the sustainable debt level for this country.
I mean, it's just completely plucked out of the air, isn't it? Aaron, I want to get your take in on this, because I suppose there's one theory, which is the reason they're obsessed with having this 100% debt to GDP ratio is because they think that this magical number has some economic significance. The other is because the Tories recognise that they can only really go into an election in a very strong position if they keep the myth alive that you have to live within your means and that the state functions like a household. Which one of those do you think it is? Do you think that Rishi Sunak is genuinely a fiscal conservative, someone who doesn't like to run budget deficits? Or do you think this is just them, I suppose, setting a trap for the Labour Party?
Such an interesting question, Michael. What I think what was notably absent today in terms of who was this budget for was the City of London, which is super interesting given obviously we're about to go, well, we are going through Brexit. It does seem like one of the big net losers at the moment is the City of London. Lots of stories coming out. Obviously, they get hugely amplified by people with various political positions prior to our leaving the European Union. Obviously, Remainers are saying, oh, look, Amsterdam is now the financial capital of Europe, not the City of London, etc. But clearly it's facing big problems. And I do think that Brexit has implications for the City of London, and therefore there is a chance that actually financial services may loom less large in the national conversation about the production of wealth, jobs, GDP growth. Not necessarily. I mean, you could have the contrary argument, which is to say, well, it's going to suffer as a result of our leaving the European Union, therefore we have to double down on it. I don't sense that, though, after today. I feel like actually the Tories are talking about other areas. And I mean, that makes sense. If you look at AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, Britain's been a world leader in, the manufacture of a really effective vaccine. So I think they'll be looking at that and they'll be saying, why not materials science? Why not renewable energy, wind turbines? Why not lithium-ion batteries? Why not, fintech and other, areas of biotechnology beyond vaccines? So I do think there is probably a bit, and like we were saying earlier, there's a bit of a shift in the zeitgeist as well. But I think there's a recognition that actually moving back to other quote unquote productive parts of the economy is not just geopolitically good, obviously in the context of leaving the EU, but also I think people recognize it's kind of necessary if you want to make some money, you want Britain to be a top 5, top 6 economy. So I think that's important, the City of London angle. And in terms of the GDP thing, I think the 100%, it's a round number. I agree. But also, I think if you think, and this is obviously dramatically changed now in the context of COVID, but if you think of those countries historically in Europe, at least, with a GDP to debt ratio of more than 100%, Greece, Italy, they aren't exactly bywords for economic success. On the other hand, California has, the most dynamic, innovative economy of all the US states, has very high levels of public debt. If you look at Japan, again, hugely impressive export-oriented economy, despite having these massive pressures on demographic aging, still the world's third largest economy. That's not necessarily true, but I think there's that context of us being a European country, looking at other European countries with 100% debt to GDP plus, and saying we don't want to be like that. But of course, it's not an issue. Public debt is a form of private wealth. It's guaranteeing returns for somebody somewhere. Yes, the taxpayer has to foot the interest, but often it's the taxpayer who's also receiving a very low rate of return, whether it's people with pensions or whatever. So we shouldn't be looking at public debt as a form of deficit, as a purely negative thing. It's also offering very stable rates of return for all kinds of people in this country.
I've got 2,000 people watching. Do share the stream. We still want to get that higher. And let's go to some comments. Tarana Amadi Parker. Oh, that's not a comment. That's just a super chat with a $5. Thank you very much. Nick Hook with a $5 says of Sunak, all the passion, vision and sincerity of a management consultant. Number 10 awaits. We'll be discussing that issue a little bit later. Henry VIII fake with a $5 says corporation tax still lower than America, but frontline public sector workers get a pay rise when? Oh no, when? They're not getting a pay rise. Let's be clear there. I read that slightly wrong. And Nathaniel Diop with 20 quid. The maxed out nation's credit card myth lives on. I think there's actually, it's interesting. If you watch the BBC at the moment, there's a bit of a dispute, I think. You've got some sort of editors who are quite confidently and proactively saying, look, the household, the debt of a country is not like a household. Actually, the Bank of England owns nearly all of Britain's COVID debt at this point. So we shouldn't look at it like that. And then you've got others, especially I think in the News at 6 and the News at 10 teams, who in their headlines are constantly saying, this is £100 billion of taxpayers' money, blah, 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 making it sort of all seem as if we still have that credit card analogy as something that is remotely functional. And we're going to move on to Labour's response. In many ways, they're sort of struggling to find a response, given that this is quite a different Tory party to the one that they have been opposing for the previous decade. We should start off by taking a look at Starmer's response in Parliament.
After the decisions of the last year and the decade of neglect, we needed a budget to fix the foundations of our economy, to reward our key workers, to protect the NHS, and to build a more secure and prosperous economy for the future. Instead, what we got was a budget that papered over the cracks rather than rebuilding the foundations. A budget that shows the government doesn't understand what went wrong in the last decade or what's needed in the next. The Chancellor may think that this is time for a victory lap, but I'm afraid this budget won't feel so good for the millions of key workers who are having their pay frozen, for the businesses swamped by debt, and the families paying more in council tax, and the millions of people who are out of work or worried about losing their job. And although the Chancellor spoke for almost an hour, we heard nothing about a long-term plan to fix social care. The Chancellor may have forgotten about it, but the Labour Party never will. The British people will rightly ask, why has Britain suffered a worse economic crisis than any major economy? The answer is staring us in the face.
So he's saying the answer is staring us in the face, and he goes on to sort of blame Sunak for opposing the circuit breaker, which was one of the reasons why we had such a high death toll and longer lockdowns in the end last winter, and also blaming the Conservatives for Tory austerity, leaving Britain ill-prepared to deal with COVID. So trying to go back to create a critique that the difficult pandemic we've had is because of the party who are in power. In my opinion, he hasn't necessarily made that consistently enough, so it probably won't land, but there we go. Jeevan, I want to ask you, you mentioned some of those things that Starmer mentioned there, the idea that what was lacking in this budget was a focus on social care. Do you think that the angle he's taken is the correct one? Is it actually the only one he could take at that point in time to say, well, there's not necessarily anything I actively oppose in the budget, but you missed out XYZ, social care and the NHS?
Yeah, I think so at the end of it all. I mean, it's a really tough gig, isn't it, responding to a budget? You only get the document there and then straight away you have to figure out what to say. So if you listen to that speech by Starmer, what you hear is a lot of lines he would have written well before the budget document had landed inside his hands. I think in the longer term, the challenge for Starmer is to take down this idea of the Conservatives ran the economy well. And I think so far at the moment, he's trying to transition out of being supportive during the COVID pandemic, and then saying, okay, well, actually, let's talk about all the mistakes you made, the costs that had, not just in terms of economics, but also in terms of people's livelihoods and their lives. And that's the real challenge going forward. You know, when you think about when do parties win and lose elections, generally speaking, if there's wage growth in an election year, you will see a win for the incumbent party, unless their reputation for competence has been completely destroyed. So we saw that in 1992 with the Conservatives. Even though the economy is growing in 97, they still lose the next election. Similarly, Labour, they kind of get it halfway through, but they still also took a massive knock to economic competence because of they were at the helm during the financial crisis. And so the challenge for Starmer is, how do you say these guys, they're not going to make you better off, and they're not very good at running the country. And then the final thing is to say is they really don't care about your lives. It's a tricky sell to make. That's certainly true. But look, this is the way you set it up, and this is the way that you transition forward. I can also see why you wouldn't want to attack a government too aggressively during a coronavirus or pandemic when people are worried about their lives. It might be seen as opportunistic. The problem is the other side of it. Do you then look like you're not really taking a hard enough stand? And does it not look like you've done enough to paint the party in power as being incompetent? And we should remember as well, look, the worst economic growth rate. Why? Because Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, argued for opening up. The worst death rate for the same reason. And at some point that has to be made very explicitly and tied to this Chancellor.
Aaron, I want your take on Labour's response, on Keir Starmer's response to that announcement. We should say, it is a very difficult gig. Apparently, normally the Chancellor is supposed to give the opposition some foresight of the budget so they can prepare their response. Apparently, this time around, Sunak refused to give any indication or notes to the Labour front bench. So you do have to some degree, make it up on the spot. What did you make of Starmer's response to Sunak's announcements today?
Yeah, there were some good jokes. But apart from the sort of wisecracks, and I think it was Labour paint by numbers, and of course to an extent that was inevitable. So social care, NHS, public sector workers, and of course Labour are right to talk about all of those things. But there was nothing unexpected or that I think in any way cut through. And I think that was inevitable because of, as Jeevan was just saying, Labour's response throughout the pandemic. It's very hard to pin a very bad year in terms of economic contraction. I think ultimately our GDP contracted by 10% last year. I mean, maybe slightly more, maybe slightly more, maybe slightly less. On a par basically with France, Italy. Germany was 5%. The US, of course, which has had a complete meltdown in terms of public health, that was a lot lower. Kind of different context though. But in the context of Europe, Britain had a really bad year. It's important to say that a bunch of other European countries did as well. There have been countries like Vietnam, like Taiwan, like China, which have seen growth and also a low death rate, which is to say there wasn't necessarily a kind of trade-off between economic growth and keeping people safe. But Labour can't make that argument, and they certainly can't make the argument about how the economy was trashed because of Sunak reopening things, particularly I think after the summer. I think that was entirely avoidable, and particularly over December last year. If you've basically agreed with them on 90% of those moves, very hard to then say, well, you're to blame for this major economic downturn. And I think Labour aren't going to make an ounce of political capital out of it for that reason. In terms of the economic credibility thing, I think Labour just picked a super strange fight over corporation tax for no particular reason. I can't get my head around it. And they were saying, well, in an economic downturn, you can't increase taxes. The proposal was always going to be over the course of Parliament. Corporation tax isn't going to go up next weekend, right? That was always the proposal, and that's ultimately what we got. And yet Labour decided to talk for a week about a bunch of ultimately very popular measures, increasing the rate of corporation tax, introducing potentially a windfall tax. Is that how you build economic credibility? They would answer yes, by the way, because for them, economic credibility, and I think this is where I would massively disagree with them, you need it, but they think it's purely a function of distancing ourselves from Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, when actually what you need to be saying is, overtly, I think, the agenda of Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell after 2015 was hugely popular. It initiated a pushback against austerity, which now many people kind of think was completely crazy, including the IMF and the OECD. And also, actually, in terms of just domestic public services, yeah, maybe not popular on foreign policy or on the military or on Russia, but on domestic public services and how we want to spend our money at home, they were really, in touch with the public mood in this country. Keir Starmer can't necessarily say that because, of course, the whole thing about credibility is distancing yourself from your predecessors. Bit of a catch-22. So I think he would have been much better placed if he'd spent the last 10 months actually being much more critical of the Conservatives. Doesn't matter if your polling goes down. It's going down now instead. Critical of the Conservatives while actually trying to portray more of a continuity with his predecessors. I do think Corbynomics and, the politics of John McDonnell, with a fresh face, professional, slick, establishment credentials, which we were told, Starmer can lean into those in order to advance a radical agenda. I can see how that would have worked. Labour haven't done it. And I think in the absence of that, it's very hard to see now. If there is an election in, say, April, May 2023, which would look like the ideal time, Labour, if there's boundary changes before then, are in deep, deep trouble. Because like I said, the Tories could expand their electoral coalition here. And I don't see who Labour is trying to appeal to. Right now, it's 10, 15% of the electorate, Leave voters in former Labour seats in certain parts of the country. You need to think much bigger than that because we're running a deficit of 20%. We've had this pandemic. We've had a lost decade. Everybody's now basically conceding, yeah, we had a lost decade over austerity for no particular reason. You need to think much bigger than that now. And it's not coming.
Mm-hmm. It's basically just virtue signaling, saying, look, we're not socialists. I want to focus on this corporation tax issue for a moment because it has been the big row, which has been tearing the Labour Party apart over the past week. I want to start by showing you a tweet from Ben Bradshaw. This was yesterday morning. He reported back from a meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party. The Free Labour MPs calling for tax increases as we emerge from the worst economic hit for 300 years, something not a single economist supports, didn't bother turning up to make their case at last night's PLP, where Keir and Annalise enjoyed unanimous support for their strategy. Now, in response to that, a friend of the show and Novara Media columnist, James Meadway, disagreed. He tweeted, untrue on not a single economist. James Meadway is an economist who has argued very eloquently as to why it's silly to call a tax rise austerity, which is what many people, Keir Starmer's outriders, are sort of arguing at the moment. We do have an economist here, though. Jeevan, are you one of the economists who does think it's ridiculous to announce a tax increase when we're in the worst economic hit we've had in 300 years?
I wouldn't say ridiculous, but I also wouldn't agree with the call. So a rise in corporation tax will lead to a hit on investment. It won't be a big hit, but it will be a hit. And the question that I would ask myself is, well, look, we had the economy shrink by 10% last year. Now, if the economy shrinks a little bit because of this tax rise, what does that cost in terms of jobs? What does that cost in terms of people's incomes? That's the question in my mind. So in my mind, I would have waited until next year to bring in those corporation tax rises and say, okay, now is the time to do it. Because even if the drag is small and even if the impact is small, it's still a small impact when we know that unemployment is going to rise further. At the moment at 5.1%, we know that's going to go a little bit more. So I would say in this year, I wouldn't support a corporation tax increase. But for those who do, I don't think there's a huge amount of difference if you increased it by 1 point this year or if you didn't. I just think it's a drag that we don't need.
Well, there won't be any increase until 2023 now, will there? Well, the argument that I've heard in terms of it not even being a drag if you wanted to do it tomorrow is that whether or not you are stimulating the economy or taking money out of the economy is the net effect of what you do. So if you take a few billion out through corporation tax, but then spend that few billion on redistributing to poorer people who probably spend more of their money anyway, then that isn't taking anything out of the economy because you're just putting it back elsewhere. You're redistributing from one part to another as opposed to sucking out of the economy.
Yeah, so there's always going to be, I think New Economics Foundation has done some really good analysis on this, and they show that the impacts of rises of corporation tax are really small. And if you have a big stimulus, the effect will be kind of swamped out. But the key word there is net, right? Like there's always going to be some impacts. Like when a tax rises, most of the time, now there are a few exceptions, land taxes is one, windfall tax is another, but most of the time you will see an incentive effect and you will see a fall in economic activity. Now, look, that's not to say you shouldn't increase taxes, right? There are really good reasons reasons to increase corporation tax. There are really good reasons to increase the top rate of income tax. There are real benefits from it. But there's always going to be a cost to the other side. And the question is the cost worth it? And for me, given what happened last year, it wasn't worth it in this year, but very much in the future.
You mentioned a windfall tax there. I want to get up public opinion on this because lots of people replied to Ben Bradley there saying, you're saying no one is supporting raising taxes after we've come out of this big economic hit. He didn't specify whether it's corporation tax or otherwise. And we have a poll from Survation, and they polled 1,000 people, representative sample, and they have asked people, would you support or oppose a windfall tax on the pandemic profits of large companies such as Amazon? And 70% support that and 9% oppose. Labour also on corporation tax. I mean, now that I suppose they are now saying they will support it because it's in 2023 instead of tomorrow. As Aaron said, I don't know if anyone was actually proposing to increase it tomorrow. But on how businesses feel about this, there was an interesting thread from Ben Glover, who works for the cross-party think tank Demos. Used to also be in my CLP when I lived in a different place. Nice guy. He tweeted the following thread. So he writes, I've been interviewing large businesses about tax for Demos. So far, I've heard almost no opposition to a significant corporation tax rise to 25% brought in gradually over time, which is essentially what's happened now. Because it's a profit tax, those that have struggled during the pandemic won't be punished, and those that have done well will pay back more. Businesses have told us this is right and fair. There's also a widespread recognition that the UK's rate is much lower than other countries, so can afford to be increased even quite significantly. Indeed, other factors, e.g. skills, regulation, appear to be much more important when choosing to locate rather than corporation tax. As a result, even quite a significant increase might not negatively affect investment decisions. Big businesses want to be seen as doing good, especially in light of huge government support for business during a pandemic. And finally, tax receipts are increasingly viewed as a part of this. Given the above, that's unsurprising that businesses have so far told us they prefer for any tax rises to be corporation tax rises over other business taxes. I imagine what we're going to hear over the next couple of days, I haven't seen what interviews they've been giving after this budget today, is they say, look, we said introduce the corporation tax. Further down the line, that's what they've announced. This is actually a win for us. Do they have a decent argument if that's what they say?
I've seen that argument already. It's preposterous. I mean, it's absurd. When this stuff was being mooted a couple of weeks ago in the Sunday papers, you know, in the Sunday Times and the FT a fortnight ago, people were very clear it would be over the course of the Parliament. You know, it wasn't coming anytime soon. So they can say that. I mean, of course, they're entitled to say that. They're politicians. You're allowed to be an opportunist when you're a politician. That's kind of in the job description. But I don't think it's legitimate. What I would say is I think it's actually, you know, the corporation tax move is partly, yes, about raising money. You don't increase, tax by 6% unless you're seriously wanting to raise money. But I actually do think principally it's a political move. And I think it's a very clever political move. And here's why. Because Labour will be going into the next election, or they were planning to go into the next election, probably to increase corporation tax. You could have increased it to 23, 24%, and it still would have been, it still is at 25% lower than I think anybody else in the G7. Yes, you have other countries with much lower corporation tax, Ireland, Malta, but of the big economies, it would still be very, very low. What Rishi Sunak has effectively done, if they implement it in 2023, is to say, we will go into that next election, saying 25% corporation tax. You'll be going into the election with 25% corporation tax, but we'll be doing it in order to pay down the debt. You'll be doing it to splurge on X, Y, Z. And I think that kind of neutralizes the idea that Labour are going to be viewed as economically competent, because Labour then have two options. Either they ditch the policies that the tax raise was going to pay for, not good, if you're trying to get your voters out, or they increase corporation tax beyond 25%. That becomes a political kind of flashpoint. You probably don't want to do that. Or, I don't know. I think it's a really smart political move. Now, is that overestimating kind of Rishi Sunak's thinking here? I think with this one move today, they've neutralized probably the biggest weapon Labour had in terms of raising money for their spending commitments in 3-4 years' time. I think it's a real problem for them now.
which would suggest actually that they're not going to cut taxes. Even I want to ask you, sort of from a Treasury economist perspective, there were lots of briefings over the weekend that what Rishi Sunak was telling Tory backbenchers he was going to do is announce tax rises now so that he could then cut them before a general election. Now, given that these corporation tax rises are coming in 2023, I can't see how that would happen. I suppose you could cut other forms of taxes. Are there going to be taxes available for Rishi Sunak to cut before a general election, or does it just seem like that story maybe was a bit of a nonsense?
I could see why Rishi Sunak wanted to do it, and I think he's politically looking ahead of it. I don't think corporation tax is where it's going to be. I can imagine him floating that idea and everyone saying, guys, or rather saying to the Chancellor, that probably isn't the greatest move. It would be seen to be kind of transparent. But look, we've seen the personal allowance threshold is frozen. We know that income tax thresholds are frozen too. Why not raise them a little bit in the year before an election to give everyone a bit of an income boost before the election? That's certainly not out of the question. It wouldn't be the kind of out of the question for him either. So look, there is very much a tax rise, or rather a tax cut in the offing that would also go to most of his voters, because who are conservative voters? Well, they tend to be higher income people, and as well as pensioners. And so, yeah, you give them a tax cut. And I would say as well, when you look at young people who support the Conservatives, they do tend to be those who have higher incomes. And so again, there is a really easy way to kind of reward, in Aaron's, as Aaron's pointed out many times tonight, the electoral coalition of the Conservative Party. I could definitely see that happening. It would probably be quite savvy politically, because at the end of it all, are elections won because the deficit's at 1% of GDP or at 0% of GDP? No, it's whether or not people think the government is competent, whether or not they feel they are better off, and whether they identify with their values. So there's very much a tax cut in the offing, and there's an election strategy there.
We're going to go on to the cult of Rishi Sunak. So I'm going to let you go, Jeevan Sundar. Thank you so much for giving us your insights this evening on the budget.
Thank you very much, guys. It was a pleasure.
Cheers. Yeah, we're moving away now from the policies within the budget. We're going to talk about Rishi Sunak himself. Before we do that, if you're watching the video and you're enjoying it, do hit like. It helps us on the algorithm. Now, the budget was a chance for Rishi Sunak to promote his vision for the British economy. But more fundamentally than that, it was a chance for him to promote himself. Earlier in the week, the Treasury put out a flashy video all focused on Rishi's first year as Chancellor. It's a full 5.5 minutes long, but we'll just show you a taster.
I'll never forget, the team said, oh, you've got to have a call. There is someone called Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance sitting in the Treasury in my office around a big table with their team, where they very calmly and methodically walked me through everything that they were seeing. And I remember when we finished the call, there was just silence.
Our planned economic response will be one of the most comprehensive in the world.
Once we knew we were going to have to lock down huge parts of the country, we knew we would have to do something equally radical to try and protect people's jobs. It was going to be an enormous challenge to get something like that designed and up and running in the time we had.
Today, I can announce it for the first time in our history. The government is going to step in and help to pay people's wages.
You know, I didn't sleep the night before furlough launched. Everyone was expecting it to be challenged, but the team at HMRC did a genuinely heroic job.
Now, Rishi Sunak's massive ego isn't really news to anyone, but many people did question why that piece of self-promotion was made by the Treasury. So that was made with public funds. It was clearly akin to a party political broadcast, yet the taxpayer paid for it, or the Bank of England paid for it, however we want to talk about these things now. One reason why it seems so ridiculous to be spending Treasury money on that is because public money is already being splashed on boosting Sunak's image. Now, you might remember this from last year. This was after Sunak announced the furlough in 2020. The BBC, so Britain's public broadcaster, introduced us to a new superhero. This is the Chancellor imagined as Superman flying. And then we can also see the Chancellor imagined as Superman helping old ladies. So that was both created by the BBC. So he gets that propaganda from the BBC, and then he also pays his Treasury PR people to make even more glowing imagery of himself. And I said that was last year. The BBC this year didn't I suppose, changed their tune. They've got another piece of equally fawning propaganda, which they put out this morning.
From newly elected backbencher to Chancellor in less than 5 years, Rishi Sunak has made light work of Westminster's slippery slope to the top. He's now got to figure out how to fix one of the biggest economic challenges this country has ever faced. So who is he, and what does he believe?
Someone who was very bright and very smart, Oxford and Stanford educated smoothie, really.
He immediately struck me as somebody that was going places.
When politicians rise quickly through the ranks, there are often raised eyebrows, jealousy, maybe even a bit of scandal. With Rishi Sunak, not so much.
It's really quite boring as a journalist if you try and write a profile on Rishi Sunak, because you call around lots of MPs and people who've worked with him to try and get the dirt, and everyone just tells you how lovely he is. I think because of the speed of Rishi Sunak's rise, he hasn't really picked up any enemies yet.
He's lovely. He's smart. That's political journalism. That's what it looks like now. That was a 4.5-minute video. We only showed you a minute of it. They did mention a couple of criticisms of Rishi Sunak. Someone mentioned Eat Out to Help Out's role in transmission, and there was a sentence about people left out of COVID support. But those 2 points took up about 10 seconds in a 4.5-minute video. There was, of course, nothing on the fact that Sunak has more blame than anyone when it comes to us going into late lockdowns. I should say anyone other than Boris Johnson, because he made the final call, or that Sunak was crucial in opposing the circuit breaker. We can also, we're used to it by now. The BBC politics team have no interest in bringing up the fact that 12 months into a pandemic, Sunak still hasn't bothered to pay people to self-isolate. This is not someone who should be getting glowing, uncritical reviews from the public broadcaster after the year we've had. Aaron, I want to go to you on this. Do you think the way that Rishi Sunak is treated by the press is exceptional? Is it a sort of exaggerated example of how we normally see them sort of defer to the party and government, or is there something special about this guy that just has them entranced?
In that sort of Twitter meme, people say, "Oh, I met so and so once at a charity do." They were very charming and so down to earth. This is how the political editor of the Daily Mirror, that was Pippa Crerar, by the way, the Daily Mirror is talking about a Tory chancellor who is worth an extraordinary amount of money, who, as you say, in a number of ways really failed to deliver when we went through the biggest crisis in this country, I think, at least since 1940. So is it unusual? I think we have to put it in a sort of broader context, which is Britain's media is moving effectively a sort of post-democratic status quo, which is to say the BBC's been neutralised. Anything they say that's critical of the government, the subtext is they're worried about losing money. Channel 4 was frozen out for doing their job. Good Morning Britain was ignored when they started asking the tough questions. The Daily Mirror wasn't allowed on the Tory battle bus at the last general election. Boris Johnson didn't do an interview with Andrew Neil for the BBC. And I think the Tories have got this right in so much as they feel we don't need to do 2/3 of the media if we don't want to. Between social media, between favourable coverage in the print press, these media oligarchs which own, the Telegraph, the Sun, the Times, we're fine. And I think that's accurate. And so for people who say, well, where's Britain going to be in 2030, 2035? Look at Viktor Orban's Hungary. And I don't say that as an exaggeration. Look at the sort of political appointments right now going on at the BBC, people very favourable to the Conservative Party. So it's explicable, it's getting worse, and it's for structural reasons. It's not just because some journalists are bad people. This is an expression of a broader problem we've been going through now for a decade.
It does also, the thing they say, is quite nice and charming. Probably true. And that is, I think, probably why, or one of the reasons why he gets such fawning press from people like Laura Kuenssberg, from people like Katie Balls, who you saw in that clip there, someone who works for The Spectator. And it is because political reporting is so much about what dinner parties you go to, who has charmed you, who you get on with. And if you are someone who is a smooth talker and can get on with people who are also members of the ruling class, then you don't get critical things written about you. And it's why, so long as you're well-educated and charming and don't challenge any of the powers that be, if you're not particularly critical of the establishment, you're not like John McDonnell, who says that, yes, of course, business elites and the BBC are going to be biased. If you're just there and you say, no, look, I'm going to be charming to everyone, then no one bothers writing about the fact that you didn't pay people to self-isolate, which would have been the one policy which would have helped us to avoid the disastrous consequences that we saw this winter. It's why people don't bother writing about the fact that you were one of the main lobbyists for a herd immunity strategy in Downing Street throughout the year. And it does make me wonder about the journalism of someone like Katie Balls, who seems like a nice enough person. But if you're saying it's boring writing a profile about Rishi Sunak, maybe you're not doing your job properly. Because there's a lot to say about this guy, right? There's a lot to say about this guy, which would be, in the public interest for you to be making known. But people are just interested in saying, oh, if there's no MP that doesn't like him, then what am I supposed to write? Maybe do some research other than checking your WhatsApp messages when Tory MPs message you.
What they're basically saying is, well, nobody briefs against him, so I haven't got any dirt. Like you say, you're not doing your job. Oh, he's charming. Do you know what? For the electorate, they don't care. Nobody cares about whether he's charming. They're never going to meet him. They want to know in terms of the consequences of his actions relating to public services, to pay, to housing. Will my mortgage get more expensive? Can my kids afford to go to university? Will I be able to access decent elderly care in a couple of years? The nursing home my mum or dad is in, is that going to get more expensive, less expensive in the public sector, private sector? How are they going to pay for it? That's what people care about. Nobody cares about Rishi Sunak's haircut, or his workout routine, or his waist size. I've seen people talk about that before, how he has a waspish waist. Good for him. I'm happy for him. It means he's less liable to get heart disease as he gets older. But as somebody who's voting for politicians, or a journalist who's covering them like you and me, Michael, it's irrelevant. If you can't find any bad stories, go find them. That's your job. That's the public interest. The public interest is to scrutinize this man as an individual and as a politician, first and foremost. And if you're there saying, I can't find anything bad about him, nobody's briefing to me on WhatsApp. This isn't like with Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell. By the way, it wasn't because those were bad people. It's because there was a vast array of interests which didn't want them getting anywhere near power. It's the complete opposite with Rishi Sunak, hence you're not getting the negative briefings. Really not that hard to work out. And I think that interview, yes, it says a great deal about how terrifyingly bad our media is, but also they don't realize what they're doing is bad. These are journalists who don't realize what their job is meant to be. And I think that actually shows a real disconnect between what we've got in this country and what you saw in the United States. Yes, it's not perfect. Yes, there are lots of journalists who will criticize Trump, but not criticize Biden when he does something broadly similar. We saw that with the airstrike in eastern Syria last week. But there are still a large number of journalists, particularly on the left, but who have in our mainstream presence, who are at least interested in getting stories on people who shape all of our lives. The vast majority of Westminster journalists, the lobby, people who work for press and broadcast, don't actually care. They want to get on with some people at the next dinner party, at the next Spectator summer garden party, and they don't want to make any enemies, and they want to get up that that career ladder, and that's it. That's it. And it's not good enough. And if you have the temerity to not want to do that, like us at Novara Media, you're an outcast. You're a horrific person. You're evil. You're malevolent. You're a racist. You're a misogynist. You name it. They will go to town. But if you're a conservative whose policy response to a pandemic has left hundreds of thousands of people in real trouble economically, and I think indirectly led to the deaths of many, 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 many people, no problem. He's so charming because he knows which fork to use at a white tie dinner.
It's also, I mean, when we talk about other journalists being partisan, there'll be people who justifiably say, but you're partisan, you supported the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn and Labour at the last general election. But did you ever tune in to Tysky and me and Aaron just talk for ages about how charming Jeremy Corbyn or John McDonnell were? No, even when we support politicians, we don't just say, "Oh, they're so nice people." We supported them because we wanted the policies. We wanted transformational policies in this country, and that's what we talked about. We never said, "Oh, whenever I call up people to ask about Jeremy Corbyn, they say he's so nice." That's it's just such a silly way of doing politics.
It's crazy. And Michael, can I say more than that? We didn't just not do that. We did actually criticize them. When Jeremy Corbyn didn't pursue open selection, we said that's not the right thing to do. When they didn't have an elected general secretary, said that's not the right thing to do. You know, when they bottled that from various confrontations, we said that's not the right thing to do. I think, you know, the idea that Novara was uniquely, you know, obsequious to former Labour leadership, my God, no. We are, I think, head and shoulders above so much the media when it comes to how we relate to politicians who may advance policies we agree with. We were far more critical. And I think anybody, look, it's all online. It's all on YouTube. Go see the interviews with John McDonnell in the run-up to the last general election. We got him in a few weeks beforehand. It was critical because we were trying to give value to our audience. We're trying to inform the viewers at home, people listening on podcasts, how is this guy going to affect my life? Charming? Who cares?
Let's go to our final story of the evening. And this story would have dominated today's headlines if it weren't for the budget. It was Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's first minister, giving evidence to a Holyrood committee on the government's flawed handling of complaints into harassment allegations against Alex Salmond. She spoke for hours, a real tough grilling, and it was happening at exactly the same time as the budget. Now, we discussed this story on Friday, and there are a number of charges being levelled against Nicola Sturgeon. Now, they include that she lied to Parliament about the date she found out about the complaints against Salmond. They include that the Scottish government ignored its own legal advice to continue fighting a case against Salmond, who was suing them for bias in their initial investigation. Now, that legal advice was released just last night, which put a lot of pressure under Nicola Sturgeon. There were calls, actually official calls from the Conservative Party for her to stand down and for a vote of no confidence. More broadly, the background here and the sort of underlying thread throughout all of it, and I should say more tenuously, Salmond has suggested that officials in the Scottish government and the chair of the SNP, who is married to Nicola Sturgeon, were part of a wider conspiracy to destroy his reputation. Now, obviously, the Sturgeon's defense was hours long. We're not going to show you all of it. This is a part of her introduction, which I thought was especially powerful. Let's take a look.
I feel I must rebut the absurd suggestion that anyone acted with malice or as part of a plot against Alex Salmond. That claim is not based in any fact. What happened is this, and it is simple. A number of women made serious complaints about Alex Salmond's behaviour. The government, despite the mistake it undoubtedly made, tried to do the right thing. As First Minister, I refused to follow the age-old pattern of allowing a powerful man to use his status and connections to get what he wants. The police conducted an independent criminal investigation. The Crown Office, as it does in prosecutions every single day of the week, considered the evidence and decided there was a case to answer. A court and a jury did their jobs. And now this committee and an independent investigation are considering what happened and why. For my part, I am, if not relishing the prospect, relieved to be finally facing this committee. But given all that has brought us to this moment, being here also makes me really sad, and in all the legitimate consideration of this, sometimes the personal and human elements of this situation are lost. Alex spoke on Friday about what a nightmare the last couple of years have been for him, and I don't doubt that. I have thought often about the impact on him. He was someone I cared about for a long time. And maybe that's why on Friday I found myself searching for any sign at all that he recognised how difficult this has been for others too. First and foremost for women who believed his behaviour towards them was inappropriate. But also for those of us who have campaigned with him, worked with him, cared for him and considered him a friend, and who now stand unfairly accused of plotting against him. That he was acquitted by a jury of criminal conduct is beyond question. But I know, just from what he told me, that his behaviour was not always appropriate. And yet, across 6 hours of testimony, there was not a single word of regret, reflection, or even simple acknowledgement of that. I can only hope that in private, the reality might be different.
Now, I always like showing clips of Nicola Sturgeon on this show because, you know, I have to admit, I'm not an expert when it comes to Scottish policy. I'm not particularly, I don't have a sophisticated critique or analysis of the SNP government. But whenever I see her speak, I think, wow, she is impressive, really persuasive. And I do think, this whole row raises some really interesting issues in politics, because it seems to me that probably on the balance of evidence, Nicola Sturgeon did break the ministerial code. I mean, I obviously there's an investigation going on, but it seems that the Scottish government pursued a legal challenge to Salmon's complaints about their investigation into him beyond the point at which their legal counsel suggested that was a good idea. And people are saying that's a waste of public money. Why did they do that? That was the wrong decision. It also seems to me kind of implausible that Sturgeon forgot a meeting which she had 3 days before she told Parliament she had found out about the allegations against Alex Salmond. There are many people now saying she knew about it 3 days before. She had a meeting with Alex Salmond's chief of staff 3 days before, and she said she forgot it. I don't think that's particularly plausible. So it seems to me that on potentially a number of counts, she has erred, right? And on a number of counts, there could be coherent requests for her to resign because the ministerial code has been broken. At the same time, I think the point she put across so well there in that bit of evidence we just saw was that there is also a political background here, right? It's not just that she was, these mistakes weren't made out of, it seems from where I'm standing, these mistakes weren't made out of malice. They weren't made to benefit herself, but they were kind of honest mistakes that were made in an incredibly difficult situation. And for me, while you have the Scottish Tories very loudly saying she should resign, I think the Labour Party are kind of keeping their powder dry. For me, it would be a problematic outcome if the most lasting result of a powerful man treating women inappropriately, and we should say, yes, Alex Salmond has been acquitted of any crime. At the same time, he's admitted himself to treating women inappropriately, right? So that's what happened in the context of Me Too, and it would, to me, not really be justice if the biggest lasting consequence of that was the resignation of a powerful woman who got caught up in it when she had no intention to. Aaron, I want to bring you in on this, not necessarily talk about the details of the case, but this issue of should someone who's broken the ministerial code, she hasn't been found to have done that yet, but it's quite possible that in the next few weeks she has. Should they necessarily resign, or should we make exceptions in a case where, like this, it seems like they were human errors made when, I don't know if they were trying to do the right thing, but this isn't a crisis of her own making. It seems to me politically complex, and we might in this case say, look, yeah, she's done wrong, she's broken the ministerial code, but this is not a reason to resign.
I think in abstraction, she probably, if she did break the ministerial code, she should resign. In abstraction, right? In a world where politicians sort of lead by upholding the highest standards in public life, she probably should. However, where else have any politicians anywhere done that in this country, in living memory? So no, I think in reality, if I was an SNP member, if I was just a Scot who, was, I can see why somebody who hates her would think she should resign. But I think any reasonable person, given the broader context of British politics, wouldn't think she should resign. That said, probity in public life is a really important thing. And just because it doesn't exist, just because, particularly in English Westminster politics, just because it doesn't exist for the likes of Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, and before them, Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell, just because these people have debased politics for so long doesn't mean we shouldn't take that seriously. But I think you're right. In this particular context, the idea that the major consequence here would be the most senior female politician in the United Kingdom resigning over somebody who he was found not guilty, but it's also right that he faced a criminal investigation. If somebody makes those kinds of allegations, that's the right thing to do. So I don't think she should resign, no. But at the same time, as you so articulately stated, Michael, I could see why somebody would make a morally coherent argument for her to go.
It's going to be super interesting to see how this develops, because I feel like more and more people are reaching kind of a similar conclusion, which is that the story doesn't quite add up. It seems like mistakes were made and some of them were serious, but a just outcome doesn't seem to be her resigning. I mean, I suppose quite likely is someone else falls on their sword, someone who's not Nicola Sturgeon, but who can take the blame. And then also we have Holyrood elections coming up. So they'll probably say, look, if I've made any mistakes, everything is out in the open now, the people can decide. I don't think she will resign, given she's so popular. She's such an asset to the SNP and the independence movement more generally. And actually, she's, people judge her to have performed quite well during the coronavirus crisis. So I can't see her going over this. I could be proved wrong. We will cover it on future shows, I'm sure. For now, Aaron Bastani, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
My pleasure as always, Michael.
And thank you for watching Tysky Sour. As you know, this organisation, this show, only possible because of our regular donors. If you are subscribed to Novara Media, or a regular supporter, to Novara Media, thank you so much. You make this possible. If not, please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you haven't already, of course, hit subscribe under this video. We go live 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. We put out videos every day. For now, we are going to leave you out actually today with a short clip, because today is an anniversary. It is today the 3rd of March 2021, if you did not know. And on the 3rd of March 2020, before 130,000 people would tragically go on to die from COVID-19, Boris Johnson said this.
I can tell you that I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody. You'll be pleased to know. And